I'm your host today. You can follow me at John A. Matthews2 on Twitter. Really excited about our show today. On Monday, we covered the upstart victories of three challengers who won congressional primaries against powerful establishment Democrats on an uncompromising left platform. Representative Rashida Tlaib, Cori Bush, and Jamal Bowman. They, along with Representatives Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, and Ayanna Pressley, are part of a growing group of movement lawmakers in the U.S. Congress. But a similar legislative revolution has also been happening in state legislatures around the country, where grassroots local organizers are taking on established party machines and they're winning. In New York in 2018, a wave of progressive challengers unseated conservative Democratic state legislators known as the Independent Democratic Conference, who caucused with Republicans. This year, even more left candidates defeated incumbent state legislators, including 4 Democratic Socialist candidates backed by the New York City Democratic Socialists of America. But these upset wins against establishment incumbents are not limited to coastal cities. In Minnesota, at the same time that Representative Ilhan Omar successfully held her seat against the centrist challenge, Omar Fateh defeated a longtime incumbent running as a Democratic Socialist on a platform of single-payer healthcare, free college, and a housing guarantee. In Oklahoma, Mari Turner, a progressive community organizer focusing on criminal justice reform, defeated an incumbent Democrat and will face off against a Republican challenger in November. State legislatures are crucial battlegrounds for reformers. Over the past 30 years, right-wing organizations like the American Legislative Exchange Council, better known as ALEC, have lobbied successfully at the state level for significant right-wing legislative shifts. Across the country, Republican legislators outnumber Democratic legislators by more than 1,000 seats, and Republicans control both houses in 32 states. Even where Democrats gain control over the legislature, as happened in New York in 2018, progressive and Democratic Socialist legislators face opposition to reforms, even from other Democrats. To discuss the less prospects for power in state legislatures, we're joined by 3 candidates: Zoran Kwame Mandani, presumptive assembly member from Astoria, Queens; Omar Fateh, elected to represent Minneapolis in the Minnesota State Senate; and Mari Turner, the Democratic nominee for Oklahoma State House of Representatives in Oklahoma City. Zoran, I'd like to start with you. Before running for assembly, you were a housing organizer and a rapper, which is not typically a path for a legislator. How did your experience as an organizer lead you to want to run for office?
So I had worked on a number of local political campaigns. As an organizer, I'd also worked specifically in housing. And the work on the campaigns had kind of opened my eyes to the way in which local politics functioned here in New York City, and the truth of how progressive or lacking our city and our state were, in contrast to the myth of the progressive beacon of the United States that is often told about us. And then in my housing work, I worked as a foreclosure prevention counselor. I worked with low to moderate income homeowners, typically of color, immigrant background across Queens, who were facing foreclosure on their longtime family homes. And so in that work that I did, I saw the ways in which our state has abandoned working class people in their time of most need. And I would see how people who had paid 27 years on their mortgage, were 3 years away from owning their home completely, were in danger of foreclosure because they either lost their job, they had a healthcare emergency, they had something happen in their family that was unforeseen. And it was my job to put their lives back together after it had been broken into a million pieces. And after a friend asked me to run, I realized that the potential of legislation is to craft laws that would ensure people's lives are never broken in the first place.
So, the foreclosure issue is huge in this moment, facing a global pandemic, both foreclosures and people even being able to pay rent. Was that a big issue in your race?
Absolutely. I mean, Astoria, which is in Northwest Queens, is one of the most rapidly gentrifying neighborhoods in all of New York City, which says a lot given that the city itself is so quickly gentrifying. 24% of Astoria tenants are spending more than 50% of their income on rent. And that's a statistic prior to the pandemic. Prior to the pandemic as well, 1 in 4 homes being bought in Astoria is being bought by unnamed investors. So it's, we're in the midst of a massive housing crisis, and it's so exciting for me to be on a panel with candidates such as these and also moderators such as yourself, because I think that oftentimes when we talk about these kinds of issues and these crises without an understanding of their true roots and the true ways in which we need to fight them all at once, it's an insufficient vision. And I think what's so exciting is that across the country, we are talking about a vision for our society that is not simply siloed in one issue. It's an understanding, like Omar's platform, that you have to fight for these things in tandem with all of the other ones, because it is a healthcare issue that can lead to a housing problem. It is a policing issue that can lead to homelessness. These are all things that are interconnected.
Can you give an example of how you connected all of those issues when you were campaigning, especially for folks out there who are thinking about running? How were you able to message these ideas in a way that was that people received?
Yeah, I think I grounded and we grounded the entire campaign around housing, because it was the issue that people face on the most daily basis. It's really the largest symptom of the crisis of capitalism here in this neighborhood. But I would make it very clear that it is an unforeseen medical emergency that can lead to you having less money that you anticipated for the month in order to pay your rent. So just falling down and breaking your arm and not having insurance could be the thing that ends up leading to you being evicted from your apartment. And it is people's lives are being lived at such kind of cut to cut, paycheck to paycheck. The margins are so small for any sense of safety or security that it could even be, hopping the turnstile when the MetroCard machine doesn't work. A police officer gives you a ticket for hundreds of dollars, and then you don't have money that you previously thought you had for the other sets of your bills for that month. So all of these things are intertwined, because we also have a system and a state here whose view to harm is punitive. And so whenever they see anything that is wrong in people's lives, they seek to double down on it as opposed to actually resolve the reason for it.
Thanks so much. So in New York, you mentioned some of this. Democrats control every branch of government. Nonetheless, New York politics often favor the rich and powerful, particularly when it comes to the real estate lobby. So what's been the reception from establishment Democrats to your campaign? Campaigns like yours, and what's the role of the New York Democratic establishment in upholding, some of these status quos?
Yeah, I think what's also so exciting about this panel is that we all know that the obstacles we're facing are not simply Republicans. A lot of times they come from within our own party, and that's why the primaries are such critical places to have a contest for ideas and visions. Because, here in New York State, I can at least say that when we ran this campaign, we ran it against the incumbent, we ran it against the Queens County Democratic Party, and we ran it against the leadership of the entire state. And now I have to have meetings with all those people. And what the nice thing is that they know exactly how I feel about them. It's no secret, and they invested very heavily in this race. The Assembly, which is one of the two houses of government here in New York State, the Democratic leadership has a PAC where they fundraise and then spend money. Typically, it used to be for protecting Democrats in general elections, but recently it's been used more and more in primaries to protect them from challenges. And the Assembly Leadership Conference spent $125,000 on my opponent just 9 days before the election. And I think that what's terrifying and what motivates so many of these kinds of actions is because we've made it clear that we're not willing to play by the rules of the game. We, in many ways, want to tear those up. And, the classic establishment thinking might be that, 2 years ago, New York did landmark rent laws. Housing is now an issue that's been dealt with. Now we can move on to something else. And we're coming in and saying, housing is not dealt with while people are still getting evicted. Housing is not dealt with while the market still determines who gets to have a place to live. We have a pretty unapologetic and unabashedly socialist agenda. And what's really exciting is that it's reframing the terms of the debate and also changing the political calculus across the state.
Amazing. Mari, I'd like to turn to you. So you're in a very different circumstance as you are running a very left campaign in Oklahoma where Republicans dominate state politics. What are the challenges of running a campaign with left messaging and policy in a deep red state? Can you break that down?
Yeah, for sure. I think for me, I think we saw a lot of the same things that Zoran saw, but also I live in one of the most progressive, if not the most progressive place to live in Oklahoma. So that helped a lot. But I think that also I told myself I was never going to be in politics in this kind of, in this way anyway. I always told myself that I was going to devote my time to finding the best candidate to represent us. I went to university to become a veterinarian. And so When I hit the ground running, specifically organizing in Oklahoma City, I was looking for folks who, because as one of the most progressive places, I was looking for folks who continuously push forward that conversation on what it meant to have shared lived experiences and what it meant to drive conversation and community organizing around equitable and inclusive policy. Um, uh, and so I hit the ground running, looking for folks to run, continuously asking people. And I don't know, but if you know, or I'm sure you're probably familiar with this stat that I think a woman has to be asked at least 7 times to run for office. And I think once you add being Muslim and Black and queer on top of that, those conversations have to shoot up. And so I think I had anywhere from 20 to 25 conversations from folks who live in the district about why we need a change in representation. And so I decided that I would take myself as serious as the community that was asking me. And I decided to run. And it looks it's very interesting because much so, like Zoran, we also had to push back on the establishment because there were women who endorsed against me. There were queer women, there were women of color, all Democrats who endorsed against me in this race. But the power and the community-based power that we continuously built and what this campaign and probably all of our campaigns are hinged on, right? That community-based power is how we made it this far and how we'll continue to push forward, right? I think that's one of the interesting and one of the best things about community organizing is that it only works because the people work, right? We are continuously filling the gaps that government has left for us. And we do so in a way that makes sure that everybody has a place to eat at this table. And that is what lies within House District 88. And that is how we were able to run such a successful primary campaign and are continuously running a successful general campaign. And so it is a very heavily red state. And I think, but I think that the times are changing, right? We see it across the nation. And I think it's really kind of indicative to be a Black Muslim queer woman, possibly the first Muslim woman representative in the history of Oklahoma to be elected in the buckle of the Bible Belt. And I think that that's really kind of indicative of this wave that is happening across the nation, but also community organizers, community activists are really stepping up to play a role in the betterment of the nation, and specifically here in Oklahoma and specifically here in Oklahoma City. So.
Thanks so much. I actually didn't know that statistics. It's pretty staggering. I wanted to ask you about community power and specifically both community power and this idea of like lived experience. And so, for example, criminal legal system reform was really big in your race. Can you talk about, how that manifested in your race, right? And specifically your experience with the criminal legal system and how that was helpful in speaking about these issues?
For sure. I think it kind of manifests itself in my life in a plethora of ways. First and foremost, Oklahoma has one of the highest rates of incarceration in the world. I think the stat is 1 in 2 people have been affected by Oklahoma's justice system in some way, shape, or form. So growing up, my father and my grandfather were in prison and jails up until I was probably heading into high school. And so, but my upbringing was with my father was very inclusive. So whenever my mom had free time, she would take us to go and see my baba, go and see my granddad. And he taught me so many life lessons, right? And yet again, small town, I grew up in small town, Oklahoma. And so I distinctly remember one time my dad was housed in a minimum security facility right outside of our town. And they would bring the folks that were incarcerated there into town to help set up for rodeos and things like that. And so my mom went and picked my dad up, snuck him back to the house and made him make us clean our rooms. Very, very, my mom also knew, right, the hold that Oklahoma's justice system has on families. And so she made sure that we had contact with our father. But around the last time that my baba was released from prison, I was spending more time outside of the home with my friends, their families, at their religious services and things like that, because that was community organizing, right? Breaking bread with people of different religions, meeting people, meeting the people where they are. And so the narrative that was being reinforced, though, was that my dad and my granddad, if they were in and out of prison, it was because they were inherently bad people and they didn't want us, they didn't want a life with us. So I internalized that up until my junior year of college. But at this time, also still with a major emphasis in my upbringing on community organizing, had been doing some organizing and some work with the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, and the Council on American Islamic Relations, CARE. And so there was an event that CARE had put on, and my mom never leaves our small town, but this time she came to Oklahoma City to attend the event. And I got a call from my great uncle, and he told me that my dad had a really bad automobile accident, and serendipitously he ended up in the hospital right across the street from the event that we were putting on. So I got to sit with my baba for the next week, and I got to listen to his story and hear that he always wanted to be a teacher, and hear how he got entangled in Oklahoma's justice system, and how once he got in it, it was just this revolving door, which is not unique to my story, right? That happens all across Oklahoma and across the nation. And that week was the week I decided that I was going to leave the idea of becoming a veterinarian behind and going to go into figuring out how to help Oklahoma's justice system in a way that is holistic and inclusive, right? One of the big conversations that we continuously have about our justice system across the nation is how it financially strains taxpayers. But we don't talk about the school to prison pipeline as much as we should, right? We don't talk about school resource officers. We don't talk about lowering barriers for folks to get into reentry programs after they leave the prison system. We don't talk about living conditions while folks are actually in prisons and jails, right? And so I was looking to see who did holistic reform like that. And that's when I came across the Campaign for Smart Justice. And being able to do that direct policy advocacy at our legislature continuously, building that bridge and really kind of highlighting that work between community organizing and the legislature, I realized much so like Zoran, that our community members really kind of get a crappy end of the deal. We get middle of the road solutions to issues that we face every day, right? And that's because we don't have people with our shared lived experiences fighting for us in the assembly, in the legislature, right? In Congress. And so if we had more people who had been directly impacted by the systems continuously every day, then our system would be a lot better. I think one of the odd things that COVID really highlighted was how families are living every day. It really put a magnifying glass on it. It didn't bring about new issues, but it really highlighted what people have to deal with every day, but now more people have to deal with it, right? And so we can't look away from it. We have to make sure we're actively working to bring people into that.
Amazing.
So,
yeah, thank you for telling your story and speaking about the revolving door and criminal justice issues. I know for you, Omar, and your race were huge, right? Because you are dealing with Minneapolis, which George Floyd's death and the protests and uprisings that followed that. Can you talk about the criminal justice issues in your race and what you'd most like to see when you reach the legislature?
Yes, absolutely. So in my district in South Minneapolis, District 62, it was actually the site where George Floyd was lynched and murdered. And it's actually right near my house where I live. And I woke up a lot of folks in this district. We saw folks take to the streets, protest, and what else did we see? We saw the National Guard coming, right? We saw the police coming in and using tear gas, like weapons that are not even used in times of war, on our people. We've seen folks getting pelted with rubber bullets at the same time. We see folks losing an eye, folks getting injured, lifelong injuries. But at the same time, we saw our neighborhoods come together and organize and take public safety into their own hands. And literally right after that situation occurred, we saw neighborhoods come together, have meetings, and form neighborhood watch groups, and not counting on the police. And in that time, we saw that our neighbors actually felt much safer having public safety in their hands than having the police come around and patrol, right? So it shows you what public safety could really look like, not having a highly militarized police that are just targeting Black and brown people. So what I would like to see at the legislature, and what I campaigned on, is making sure that does not happen again, making sure that our folks are not attacked with tear gas and not attacked with weapons like that. But at the same time, and Marie and also Zoran spoke about this, we need to make sure that we are working to help folks that are formerly incarcerated, right? Making sure folks have the right to vote, folks that are struggling to secure housing, secure a job, start a business. I know right now I'm speaking to someone who was recently released. She's a young African-American woman. She wanted to start a business that required a license from the Department of Human Services. And what happened? She was blocked, right? Even though she was off paper, she was 7 years away from serving her time and being an off-paper felon. What happened was the Department of Human Services, they did a background check that was actually 10 years long, right? So she was blocked because of that from receiving that license. So there's stuff at the state level we can do to make sure we're better reintegrating folks that are formerly incarcerated into society, making sure that they have the rights restored, making sure that they can secure housing, have a job, and become regular members of our society again.
Thanks, Omar. I'd also like to talk about the idea of organized labor and workers' rights in your race in particular. So as a democratic socialist, you've been a very vocal supporter of organized labor in Minneapolis, in which unions play a powerful role in local politics. However, some major unions like AFL-CIO and AFSCME supported your primary opponent. What do you see as the role of unions in some of these progressive campaigns against more moderate incumbents? And do you see that role changing?
Absolutely, absolutely. And right now we're actually partnering with many of the local unions around, in this time of COVID, having service workers, for example, organize. Right now, in my district, we live in one of the most, or if not the poorest district in Minnesota. We see folks that have seen their wages stagnate while their rents have skyrocketed. A lot of folks that have been priced out of housing. We've seen an increase in homelessness, and we've seen folks that have lived a long time without any health insurance, right? For example, my wife, she works for St. Stephen's Human Services, and that is a local nonprofit group that helps find, that secures housing for our homeless population. And in my time volunteering with them and seeing what was going on, yes, there are folks that struggle with addiction issues or mental health issues, but there are a lot of folks that are also actually do have a job, and they're just not being paid a livable wage, right? And they can't close the gap between staying in a homeless shelter and the most affordable housing unit, because the way affordable housing is calculated in our state and where we live, it's not really affordable. Folks are seeing developments come up where a one bedroom is costing $1,200, right? So what we want to see is, number one, a statewide $15 an hour minimum wage, which we can get together with the organized labor folks, right? And making sure that everyone has the right to unionize and form a union. Right now, we're working with a group called Unite Local 17 that are organizing with our local service workers, and a large number of our district folks are hourly workers that are in the service industry, right? Folks that are risking not only their health, but their life in times of COVID to provide services such as coffee for us, right? Just so we can maintain a little bit of normalcy in this time of crisis. And we're just fighting to make sure that they're number one, able to form a union. Number two, they're provided hazard pay, and also making sure that the managers and the owners are respecting them in a way that they understand that they're able to get these profits because of the work of these labor groups. So coming in, me and our other friends that are freshmen that are coming in, we're not going to have that institutional power that incumbents have, right? So we're going to have to rely on the labor movement. We're going to have to rely on our community. We're going to rely on people power. And all of us, I believe, are much better equipped with that rather than any institutional power. we'd rather be in this position, having the full force of the people behind us.
So there's definitely a theme with each of you, which is people power and the power of organizing. Something else all of you have in common are all three of you are Muslims in a political climate that can still be very bigoted against Muslims. How did your identity affect the kind of coalition you were able to build to win your primaries? And what advice do you have for people, Muslim or any other group that feels like they typically aren't what the normal candidate, quote unquote, looks like? What advice would you have for those folks that are considering running? And we could start with you, Zoran.
Yeah, I would just want to say, Omar said $1,200 for a 1-bedroom, and I was like, that sounds amazing. We got to come through.
Great.
It is. Oh man, we have a warped mindset here in New York. But I think that it is really exciting to be on a panel with two other incoming Muslim legislators, because I think that at least here in New York City, and I feel like this is true across much of our country, we've been told that good Muslims and bad Muslims were all viewed through the lens of how we can prevent or create terror. And there's no understanding of us as individuals with humanity or from collectives or communities that are just as real and multifaceted as every other community in this country. And there are even people within our own community who, well-intentioned though they may be, would give advice like, don't talk about being Muslim, and just don't bring it up, and just leave it at the side. And what I'm really proud of is that an organizer here in New York City, her name is Alia Latif. She's like an elder sister to me. She told me at the beginning of this race, make sure that at the end of every day, when you look at yourself in the mirror, you like what you see and you believe in that person. And that is the same person that began this race. And so one thing that I began this race with the belief in is that being Muslim is not incidental to me. This is in many ways my connection to the understanding and the idea of community and of social justice. And the time of putting things that may seem uncomfortable to the side is over. And I think that's why I'm so, proud and happy to be a Muslim socialist, because these are things that have played formative influences in my understanding of the politics that we need to have in New York City, in New York State, and across this country. My advice to people is that make sure that when you run in a way that is true of the reason that you got excited in the first place. Right? I got into organizing in the first place because I was involved in Palestinian solidarity activism. And so when I started to run, I made sure that would be a part of my story as to why I decided to challenge power as it is constructed and constrained across this country.
Awesome. Omar, I know you have a hard stop, so I'd like to get you in, and then Mari, you can close us out with final thoughts.
Awesome, thank you. We live in one of the most diverse districts, if not the most diverse district in Minnesota. And what we did was we worked to build a multiracial, multi-generational movement, specifically within our district. We have the largest population of indigenous folks in our district. 26% of our district are from the Latino community. We have a large East African population. So we brought together folks that care about issues around immigration, housing, environmental justice, and having a livable wage, for example, and making sure that folks understand how all these issues how all these issues are interconnected, right? I had a meeting with some of the East African folks around environmental justice issues, something that hasn't been done before in our area, and having them understand that some of the judgments, some of the decisions we make here affect what's going on back home. Somalia has been hit by drought and famine, right? And that's because of the global decisions that have been made, and having them understand what's going on. So I think that making sure that everybody understands how all of these issues are connected, and fighting for our neighbor and not just yourselves is critical. When we go to a Black Lives Matter rally, we see folks from all backgrounds coming out, right? When we go to a CARE rally, Council of American Islamic Relations rally, for example, we see more non-Muslim LGBT folk than Muslims there, right? So making sure that we care about our neighbors and our communities as much as we care about our own community as well. And I think that was a winning message. We worked on having a working class agenda that speaks to everybody. And I think that was the winning formula for this race.
Awesome. And understand if you have to jump before we close, Omar, but really appreciate your time. Mari, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think for me, going into this, that was like one of the first and foremost things at the front of my mind, running in Oklahoma as a Muslim. And so being able to sit with that and think about if I was ready to step out in the public eye, not as being a Muslim. I feel like everybody that I know knows that I'm Muslim, right? That's not a secret. I sit on the board for CARE, like that is just me. But wondering if stepping into the arena of politics in Oklahoma and being Muslim was something that I was ready to do. So I had to sit down and I had to think about that. And I talked with my baba, I talked with my mom intensely about that because it's not, I had to think about that it's not just me as well. I have to make sure that I'm protecting my family too. And so I sat down and I thought about it, and then, but I still needed a little bit of guidance. And so I was able to, I guess also someone that I think of as a sister or an auntie, I guess. But so I was able to sit down and talk with Congresswoman Omar about her run and what that meant to her, because as an idol of mine, right, someone that I look up to be able to walk in similar shoes and just to kind of get that outside input. And it was essentially, right, a bit of the same advice was to make sure that you are comfortable, like with yourself at the end of the day, make sure that you don't lose sight of why you did this in the first place, right? Born and raised a community organizer. And even while I was on that road to becoming a veterinarian, the people would ask me what I wanted to do. And that was, my answer was, I just want to help people at the end of the day. And that is something that we made sure that we keep at the core of this campaign, right? Is helping people and making sure that we are doing so in a way that is equitable, right? So instead of spending a lot of money on digital advertising and yard signs and things like that in Oklahoma, we made sure that we were paying people who had been laid off, 0-hour furloughed during COVID, right? We made sure that we had set aside money to pay people for the work that they did for this campaign if they wanted to be paid. It was really kind of overwhelming, a number of people that I would ask about it. And they said, oh no, I just want to volunteer. Like, don't worry about the funds, right? That was something that kind of helped me center the fact that we are doing something that folks see themselves in and they want to be a part of, right? Funds or no funds. And making sure that we did so in a way that met the people where they were at, right? And so that was that I can't help but echo those sentiments, and that kind of advice that I was given was, right, to make sure that you are doing something that stays true to the nature of why you're doing it and that you're helping people at the beginning and at the end of each day. I think one of the key parts of being a community organizer is being able to listen to people and yet again, like meeting people where they're at. And so, and bringing them along on this journey, right? Community organizing is about changing hearts and minds and changing power, right? And so I think if you keep the people that you're fighting for at the center of the fight, then it really goes a long way.
So that's a perfect place to close. I really appreciate you, Mari, and Zoran and Omar for coming on and spending time with us. Congrats to both of you and to Omar. And thanks everybody for tuning in and joining the briefing. This episode will be available as a podcast on Apple Podcasts and wherever you listen to podcasts. Also follow Appeal News on Facebook and the Appeal on Twitter for the latest news. We'll be live again tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern to talk to Mondaire Jones, who's running for U.S. House, New York District